So this is Max Pensky. I'm a co-director of the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention. I'm delighted to have with us today Rachel Brown. Rachel, as our practitioner in residence, Rachel Brown is the founding director of Project Over Zero, based in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, she was a fellow at the Simon Scott Center of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And prior to that, she spent 4 years in Kenya, where she founded and directed her own NGO that was addressing ways of mitigating post-election atrocity violence. So first of all, Rachel, welcome to Binghamton University and to the Institute. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's been a really great week being here and talking to students.
Great. We've really enjoyed having you. So let's jump right into it. I mean, one of the things that I think has connected your work and your talk, your visit so powerfully with the students, is that unlike sort of high-level policy analysts or people talking about the responsibility to protect or international prosecutions, you're talking about something that they know and live every day, which is the way that social media platforms, online communication, things that they are deeply familiar with, how those things can be weaponized. So when you use that word, weaponized, what exactly do you mean by that? Because that's a very powerful term, and I think that in some sense it must be literally true. So can you walk us through what you mean when you talk about the weaponization, for example, of social media like Twitter or Facebook?
Yeah, and I actually would say I think about it as the weaponization of communication more broadly. And I really think about communication in a pretty holistic way. So I'm not just talking about me saying something to you. I'm talking about communication as all the different ways that we receive information throughout the day, that we share information, that we express ourselves. And so communication can be a picture, communication can be a shirt that I wear, or sort of something that I wear as a badge, a pin. It can also be the words that I say. It can also be done through a song. So communication, we're communicating all the time. And when I think about the weaponization of communication, what it really comes down to for me is the use of communication as a powerful tool for violence. And when something's a tool for violence, it's a weapon. So you have a hammer, you're using it to build a house, it's a tool. You're using it to hurt someone, it's a weapon. And so communication is a really powerful and important tool and part of what it means to be human. We're communicating all the time, and we're when I will argue over and over again that you cannot have the type of genocide or mass atrocity that we're talking about. You cannot have that type of identity-based violence, or really any type of identity-based or intergroup violence, without communication being used as a tool for that violence. It's used to mobilize groups. It's used to make sense of events. It's used to decide who is the us and the them, and to describe that to people, and to put social pressures for participation or silence. And because communication is so inextricably linked with identity-based and intergroup violence, because you can't have that type of violence without communication, we have to then ask ourselves, what are the different ways in which communication gets used as a weapon? And when we see new technologies come online, new means and channels for communication, again, you think about the hammer, their tool. People are using this social media platforms, text messaging, whatever it might be, to make connections, to form bonds and build groups, and to understand the world around them. And people who are working to promote violence are also going to use those same new tools and channels of communication as a weapon, as a way to mobilize people towards violence.
That's really interesting, and I think that I wanted to follow up on that, but one of the things that I think I wanted to ask you to follow up on is, granted your point is got to be right, and yet in terms of how we've seen mass or public communication work as atrocity enablers. I mean, the transformation from the primary use of radio, for example, in the Rwandan genocide in the middle 1990s, where it's really a 100-year-old technology that was being the primary communication driver, to something like the Myanmar attack on the Rohingya population, where it was, as according to reports, it was really Facebook that did a great deal of the work in toward sort of not just inciting hatred, but also coordinating the hatred. Given what you say, that that communication, all communication can be weaponized, do you see any really important differences between all previous forms of communication and new online social media that have arisen, for example, in the last 10 years or so?
Yeah, I think with every new technology, you can ask what are the really important differences, right? With the printing press, it let people copy and get out information in a new way. Same with radio, same with cassette tapes. Film, right? This more emotive medium that you can bring people together around. So I think the way I look at it with every single new information communication technology, we have to understand what are the new functionalities that it's affording, what's particularly new about that technology and how it changes the ways we're able to communicate with each other and the incentives around that. And we also have to ask how it interacts with a particular conflict context. What are the power dynamics? What's the level of control exercised by a state? What are the fault lines that exist within a society, right? So it's how does this functionality interact within a society and also with our hardwiring as humans and with the different dynamics and things about us that could activate it in conflict, right? Our need to belong, emotions like fear. So when we look at these new social media platforms, I'll take us back for a second to in Kenya when I started the work there, we were looking at cell phones and text messages, which is much simpler in a lot of ways, right, than Facebook. But that was such a game changer in that it changed the speed of communication and the distance that it could travel fast. So you could communicate across geographies faster than ever before and accelerate revenge cycles and stories of what was going on in different places. And it enabled a much greater coordination capacity if you wanted to bring people together and mobilize for violence. But even in that case where you had a new technology that was entering sort of the playing field of violence, you still had radio being used. You still had in-person meetings and rallies, right? It didn't replace all the other older forms of communication. In Rwanda, when you had radio being used, right, to set norms and to broadcast to people the punishments that would await them if they, for example, stuck their neck, decide to stand up against violence. You also had people mobilizing their neighbors. You had the in-person communication, the in-person pressures. And if you look at Myanmar, there's Facebook, but there's the printing of Facebook pages into Facebook books and the way that they made themselves into communities, into tea houses. And there's the fact that for the organization and coordination of violence, you also have closed WhatsApp and Viber groups, right? So I think we have to ask how the different channels of communication in a society fit together and which channels are used for what, right? So if you have Facebook, it's a more public space. You can set norms, you can spread rumors and sort of change the environment that you're in. But if you want to coordinate a group of people to go out and do something, you probably want a smaller, more coordinated conversation, right? So I think the one thing I will say is that you have to look across mediums and channels. The thing about particular social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, is that they're sort of a new public square, right? That you can have this mass participation and that they are, it's not just a one-way form of communication and it's not just a two-way form of communication like a phone call, right? You're creating the communication in front of you based on what you're selecting and choosing. And so it means that our sort of hardwired biases can be put on steroids by the choices that we're making to look for things that confirm our existing beliefs. It also, I think, enables the creation of community across geography in a way that we haven't been able to have before, because you can belong in a group, you can share consistently content that's very emotive, and so I think that's really important when you look at some of these sort of transnational narratives of fault lines and of conflicts and about different groups. And so I guess I would say that there's the ways in which each new type of communication technology are the same as others is that they're going to change dynamics. The specific things that they change are different. And I think we're still figuring out with social media what that looks like, because we're also learning the power dynamics of the medium itself, right? So on the one hand, it democratizes content creation. We can all go online and there's this anonymized capacity. On the other hand, where you have a state actor that's really powerful and able to control it, it gives them better access to control a population or to monitor a population and be more efficient, for example, with repression. So I think in general, we have to think about the intersection of these technologies with a context, with our brains. And I think that there are certain things that are special about sort of this wave of communication, the speed, the distance, the consistency with social media, what we're able to share. But I also don't think it's sort of the last frontier. If we look forward, there's AI, there's virtual reality, and those will bring even new challenges. So I think we need to look at and understand social media, and I think we have to use it as an opportunity to say, we're not going to play catch up again for the next wave of new information communication technologies that come online. We're going to start thinking now about how do we adapt when it's a VR platform or when AI is able to do new things.
maybe tell us a little bit about what some of those current adaptations look like. I mean, how, as a prevention practitioner, how do you think about approaches for de-weaponizing communication, and particularly in contexts where there is an established and substantial atrocity risk?
Right. And I think that's a really important question. And it's how do we understand the ways communication is being leveraged as a weapon for violence? How do we mitigate that? And then how do we say this is a really powerful, amazing tool for collective action, for norm setting, all of these things? How do we use it in a proactive, positive way to move forward, and to create more positive change, to create a more sustainable and lasting peace? And so there's a few ways to think about it. I think when we ask about the communication ecosystems around conflict, we get to include a lot of actors that might otherwise get ignored. So I'll go back to Kenya. It's in some ways, it's a straightforward example compared to when we consider, because we were focused on text messaging, so compared to when we think about things like Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, there's a simplicity to the technology that we were looking at. But when you start to ask, what's the information ecosystem around conflict, you start to include people like the women selling tomatoes on the side of the road, like the boda boda motorcycle drivers, because like people that go to the marketplace, like the bartender, right? Like influencers, and people that their influence isn't even necessarily because people are looking up to them as a leader. They're not necessarily a local religious leader. That's a category that often gets included. You're looking at people that play an important role in how information spreads in a community, and we often overlook these groups and these actors. And so I think that's one thing that we can think about when we look at using communication for prevention and interrupting negative information flows. When you do a conflict stakeholder analysis, or you think about who's engaged, you can think about this whole tier of people that are influential and important, but that otherwise wouldn't get included in conflict prevention programming. And so I think that that's one really important implication. I think the general approach is also to ask, what is this? And we see patterns of communication over and over again that get used for violence. We can ask, what is it that this communication is doing? How is it setting a norm that not only motivates people who might want to be willing to participate in violence, but silences those who might credibly oppose it, but pushes them to the margins, discredits them, makes them afraid to speak out, right? Sets the norms of a society. What are the emotions that it's tapping into, or the grievances or lived experiences that this communication is activating within populations, right? So when we start to ask, what is this dangerous or hateful rhetoric doing to a society, then our interventions aren't just to speak directly to the messages and directly to the rhetoric. That's one small component of what you can do, right? It means that what we can do is say, how do we undo the damage that it's done? How, when people are being silenced and discredited, can we help them collectively raise their voices? How, when people feel scared to speak out, can we make it safer? And I think it's really important when we think about this, we're not just thinking only about the piece of negative speech and the person saying it. We're asking, how is this changing the fabric of a society, the norms of a society, the actions of a society? And our inroads then, just like when we expand the set of actors to include communication actors, our inroads for interventions are also expanded from just we have to talk back to this speech to, wow, we can activate this group that's been sort of apathetic and doesn't think that this has to do with them. Or we can make these people that want to speak up but they aren't, but they feel scared to do so. We can bring them together and give them a platform to do that in a way that feels a lot safer to them. Yeah.
So that's really interesting, and I think that it makes sense in the way that you've, over the course of your stay here, been talking about these kinds of responses as really upstream prevention, as really capacity building, resilience building in societies to make them, to sort of reduce or mitigate or slow the process of weaponizing communication, which makes a lot of sense. How about when we move from sort of upstream prevention, which we think about in terms of societies trying to build resilience, to midstream prevention, when some sort of atrocity event is either imminent or has just begun? Are there mechanisms or approaches or strategies, maybe even framed in the context of R2P, Pillar 3, yes, that you know about or you're interested in, that you're following, that can do things like, if not shut down, incitement, then at least respond in real time in ways that would be more of a response to atrocities rather than capacity or resilience building. Does that question make sense?
It makes complete sense.
I think it's a really important question, and actually a long-term goal of Over Zero in terms of a contribution that we want to make to this space is to try and ask, along this spectrum of risk, what are the types of actions that are possible upstream but that become impossible when you move further downstream? And what are the types of interventions and programming that become more important the further downstream you are? So where there's violence that includes some element of sort of revenge cycles, where violence is happening and it's being used to escalate violence. So this might not be when an atrocity is already happening, but in the lead up, right? And we see that a lot, where violence begets more violence. I think communication has a really powerful role to play in interrupting those cycles. I think when we look at early warning and response systems, we can look at what do these new communication technologies mean for how an outside actor can monitor and understand what's going on in a context, but also how we build the sort of human and relational infrastructure and scaffolding and the communication channels within that enable real-time information sharing between different stakeholders who have different types of knowledge and different types of access and resources. So between someone that is in their community experiencing violence or experiencing an escalation of tensions and knows what's going on. And often these are the people who are the most motivated for response. So we can raise all the warning flags that we want, but it often is a really slow roll to get larger institutions to intervene, whereas people who are dealing with it in their day-to-day lives, they're not intervening, they're just reacting, they're responding out of really a need for protection and to stop what's going on. And so if we can connect that set of stakeholders, right, to people that have a different type of access, a different type of resource to channel to them, I think that the role of communication in early warning and response is really important, both with communication itself as a response in the case of those sort of violence begetting violence escalation cycles, but also in terms of facilitating interaction across different types of stakeholders. The third thing that I think is really important is protection, right? So as atrocities are happening, there's a question about how can you use communication for civilian protection, right? How can that be integrated into civilian protection approaches where there are moments of sort of panic and uncertainty and people know what's going on around them but might lack access and information to sort of see the bigger picture of what's happening and make choices. Can communication be a route to provide people with greater agency through that greater knowledge and information set? And I've seen, I know there's places that work on like phone-based alerts when a strike is coming in or something like that. So I think that there is also ways to use this communication for civilian protection at the sort of farthest downstream moment. And then there's post-atrocity, right? Making sense of what's happened, gathering the evidence and information, and using communication as a tool on that pathway as well.
So I'd love to hear about Over Zero. And I know that what we've heard is that you're now concentrating, your organization is concentrating in two areas. One is Central and Eastern Europe, and the other is here domestically in the United States. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about the agency, the organization, and its projects.
Great. So Over Zero is really focused on preventing identity-based violence and other forms of group-targeted harm. And really we bring this lens of asking how is communication weaponized and how can we turn that around? How can we use communication as a powerful tool to do quite the opposite of divide and pave the road towards violence and ultimately coordinate it? And so our work, the sort of actions that we take, we're very interdisciplinary. We work really hard to bring research and practice together. And so we do a lot of trainings and capacity buildings for people who are designing, programming, and taking action. We sort of bring a whole set of tools and research and insights from peace building, social psychology, neuroscience, marketing, to really put that in the hands of people that are trying to design programs. So we have a big training program. We do some strategic advising to high impact initiatives. We help incubate and test new approaches because we're really committed to building the learnings around how we can communicate, how we can use communication as a really powerful tool to prevent identity-based violence, because there's really a need to build out that toolkit and to build our knowledge of evidence-based approaches. So we do a lot of that research practice collaboration to incubate and test new ideas. We also connect people across regions. So we, for example, in our Central Europe work, brought people together across the Visegrad region from different countries, both practitioners and researchers, to share what they're learning and what they're seeing, and build really these learning communities to, again, over the long term, hopefully build our knowledge and our set of tools to respond when we see this type of communication. And we also do publications and speaking in different spaces to sort of bring more people together to think about this, and to bring our learnings into a more public space. And so our work right now has concentrated in Central Europe and in the US, with a couple of small projects in East Africa that we've been able to support.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, it's been great talking to you, and I just wanted to say it's been a real treat to learn about your work, and all the best of luck with Project Over Zero and the incredible stuff that you're doing. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And I would just also love to add that it's been amazing to be able to spend the week here. And I think that the work of the center to really bring people together across disciplines and build this sustainable model of integrating it into the curriculum and bringing this type of thinking and subject to students is so important. And so I'm really glad and feel honored to be part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.